The bell above the door jingled softly as the morning light spilled into Rosie's diner, casting long shadows across the freshly mopped floor. Maya Coleman glanced up from wiping down the counter, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The breakfast rush had just begun to subside, the familiar hum of conversation and clinking silverware settling into a gentle rhythm. Then she saw him, standing hesitantly at the threshold, as if gathering the courage to step inside. Jake Harmon, tall and weathered, his shoulders slightly hunched beneath his faded navy jacket. His eyes, deep-set and cautious, scanned the room with the vigilance of a man who had learned long ago that safety was never guaranteed. At his side stood Shadow, a sleek black German shepherd with intelligent eyes that never left Jake's face. The service vest hugged the dog's muscular frame, a silent declaration of purpose that spoke volumes without a single word. Jake's hand rested on Shadow's head, fingers gently moving through the fur, a gesture so subtle yet so vital, like an anchor keeping him tethered to the present. Before we jump back in, tell us where you are tuning in from and if this story touches. You make sure you are subscribed, because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you. Good morning, Mr. Harmon, Maya called out, her voice warm as fresh coffee. Your usual booth is open. Jake nodded, a barely perceptible movement. He moved with deliberate steps toward the corner booth that offered a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen. Shadow matched his pace perfectly, as synchronized as dancers who had rehearsed their steps 1,000 times. The diner wasn't crowded, just a few regulars nursing their coffees, a family of tourists poring over maps, and a couple of truckers finishing up their pancake stacks. But as Jake moved through the space, a ripple of awareness followed him. Eyes shifted, conversations paused mid-sentence, then resumed a touch too quickly. Maya watched as Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop pursed her lips slightly, her gaze lingering on Shadow before returning to her crossword puzzle. At the counter, Bill Mason, the hardware store owner, straightened his back almost imperceptibly, a reflexive response from one veteran recognizing another. Shadow settled beneath the table, curling into a protective half-circle around Jake's. A feat. Only his head remained alert, ears twitching occasionally at sounds too faint for human detection. Coffee, black, and the simple breakfast, yes? Maya asked, setting a glass of water on the table. She always spoke directly to Jake, never raising her voice or showing pity in her eyes. Just simple human dignity offered without fanfare. Please, Jake replied, his voice low and graveled, as if rusty from disuse. His hands marked with scars, and calluses carefully unfolded the paper napkin. They trembled slightly, a tremor that worsened on his bad days but never fully disappeared even on his good ones. From across the diner, a child's voice piped up, "Mommy, why does that man have a dog inside?" The question hung in the air, innocent yet loaded with potential complications. Jake's shoulders tensed, his breathing quickening just enough that Shadow immediately pressed closer to his leg, a gentle pressure offering silent support. Maya moved, with casual precision, positioning herself between Jake's booth and the curious eyes of the child. "Coming right up with your coffee, Mr. Harmon," she said, her voice carrying just enough to gracefully redirect attention. In the kitchen, she could hear Cook grumbling about the health code, but his complaints lacked conviction. Everyone at Rosie's had long since recognized that Shadow wasn't just any dog, and Jake wasn't just any customer. The morning light continued to strengthen, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air above Jake's booth. For now, at least, the routine held. Another day, another breakfast, a small victory in a world that often seemed designed for someone else. The air shifted in Rosie's diner as the front door swung open, bringing with it a gust of autumn air and two new customers. The Wilsons, Carl and Diane, swept in with the self-assured presence of people who believed the world existed to accommodate them. Designer sunglasses perched atop carefully styled hair, fingers adorned with gold, that caught the morning light. Maya's smile tightened almost imperceptibly as she led them to a booth, the only one available, directly across from where Jake sat, with Shadow resting vigilantly at his feet. Jake kept his eyes fixed on his plate, methodically cutting his eggs into perfect squares, each bite measured and deliberate. The routine was important. The routine kept him anchored. "Is that a dog?" Diane's voice carried across the diner, pitched just loud enough to ensure others would hear. "In a restaurant." Carl leaned forward, his cologne arriving before his words did. "Health code violation if I've ever seen one," he muttered, loud enough for neighboring tables. "Someone ought to report this place." Jake's knife stilled against his plate for 3 heartbeats before resuming its careful rhythm. His breathing deepened, the technique his therapist had taught him. In, out. 4 counts in, 6 counts out. Shadow sensed the shift, pressing his weight more firmly against Jake's leg. The diner's ambient noise seemed to recede, leaving only the Wilsons' voices in sharp relief. "It's unsanitary," Diane continued, unfolding her napkin with exaggerated flicks. "People bring these emotional support animals everywhere these days. My cousin Brenda got one for her anxiety, a Chihuahua. Now she takes it shopping at Nordstrom." Jake's jaw clenched, the muscle twitching beneath 3-day stubble. His hands that had once disarmed explosives with surgical precision, now trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. The ice clinked against the sides, a sound that suddenly seemed as loud as artillery fire. "I can't believe they let just anyone claim they need a service dog." Carl's voice dropped to a theatrical whisper that carried like a shout. "Probably just wanted to bring his pet to breakfast." From across the room, Bill Mason looked up from his coffee, eyes narrowing beneath his VFW cap. Mrs. Henderson's crossword pencil had stopped moving. The family of tourists glanced uncomfortably at their children, who were watching the scene unfold with unguarded curiosity. Shadow's ears flattened slightly, his dark eyes fixed on Jake's face, reading the subtle signals of distress that no human could detect. Under the table, Jake's left leg began to bounce, a small involuntary movement that started in his heel and traveled upward. "Some people will do anything for attention." Diane sighed dramatically, opening her menu with a snap. "Or special treatment." A memory flashed behind Jake's eyes, sand and heat and the deafening roar that had changed everything. His throat tightened, the diner's walls seeming to press inward. Shadow responded instantly, rising slightly to place his head on Jake's knee, breaking the spiral before it could fully form. Maya appeared at the Wilsons' table, coffee pot in hand, her knuckles white around the handle. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying a chill that hadn't been there moments before. "Coffee?" Jake focused on Shadow's steady presence, on the weight and warmth of the dog's head against his leg. He took another bite of eggs, now tasteless in his mouth. 3 more bites, and he could leave. 3 more bites, and he could escape the stares, the whispers, the judgment in eyes that had never seen what he had seen. Outside, clouds gathered on the horizon, the promise of rain hanging in the air, mirroring the storm building within the diner's walls. "Excuse me, manager." Diane's voice cut through the diner like a knife, her manicured hand raised in the air, diamond bracelet catching the light. "We need to speak to whoever's in charge here, now." Todd Reynolds emerged from the back office, his tie knotted too tightly and his smile stretched too thin. He'd owned Rosie's Diner for only 6 months, inheriting it from his uncle who'd run it for decades, but already the stress had carved permanent lines around his eyes. His gaze darted nervously between the Wilsons and Jake, immediately sensing the brewing storm. "Is there a problem?" Todd asked, adjusting his tie as he approached their table. Carl leaned forward, lowering his voice to a stage whisper. "That man has a dog in your restaurant. We're trying to enjoy our breakfast, and there's an animal not 10 feet away from where we're eating." Jake's shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. Shadow, sensing the shift in his owner's posture, lifted his head slightly, but remained perfectly still otherwise. The veteran's eyes, deep wells that had witnessed horrors most couldn't imagine, finally lifted to meet Todd's uncertain gaze. "Shadow is a service dog," Jake said quietly, his voice rough as if each word was drawn from somewhere deep and painful. "He's allowed by law to be here," Diane scoffed, the sound harsh against the diner's hushed atmosphere. "Everyone says that these days. My sister's neighbor has a service cat that's really just a pet she wants to take everywhere." Bill Mason set down his coffee cup with deliberate force, the sound reverberating through the now silent diner. Mrs. Henderson's pencil snapped between her fingers, but Jake remained calm, his breathing measured. A man who had faced far worse than this. "He's a certified service animal," Jake explained, his voice steady despite the tremor in his left hand. "For PTSD, he's trained to—" "I don't care what he's trained for," Carl interrupted, his face flushing. "It's a health violation. People are eating here." Maya appeared at Jake's side, coffee pot still in hand, her knuckles white around the handle. "Shadow has been coming here for 2 years, she said quietly. "He's cleaner than most of the customers." All eyes turned to Todd, who shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the floorboards creaking beneath him. The diner had fallen completely, silent. Even the sizzle from the grill seemed to have paused in anticipation. "I'm sorry, but I think they have a point," Todd finally said, unable to meet Jake's eyes. "We can't have animals in here, it's just policy." "It's the law," Jake corrected, no anger in his voice, just a quiet certainty. "The Americans with Disabilities Act protects service animals. Shadow stays with me." Todd's face reddened. "Look, I don't want trouble. I've got a business to run here." "Then run it according to the law," Bill Mason called out from his seat at the counter, his voice carrying the weight of his 70 years. Diane threw her napkin on the table. "Fine. If you won't remove the dog, we're leaving, and we'll be calling the health department on our way out." "I need to ask you to take the dog outside," Todd insisted, his voice cracking slightly. "Just until they're gone. Please." Jake's hand found Shadow's head, fingers curling into the thick fur. The dog remained motionless, a steady presence amid the chaos. For a moment, the diner held its breath. Then, with careful movements, Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, Shadow's service dog certification. He placed it on the table without a word, the official seal visible to everyone. "My dog stays," Jake said softly, his voice carrying more authority than if he'd shouted. "I served this country for 22 years. I've earned the right to eat my breakfast in peace." The air in the diner crackled with tension as Todd stood frozen, caught between profit and principle, while outside, the gathering storm clouds finally broke, rain beginning to tap against the windows like distant drumbeats. "I'm sorry, but you need to leave." Todd's voice had changed, hardened with false authority as he stood straighter, trying to fill the space with importance he didn't possess. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. "I can't have this disruption in my establishment." Jake remained seated, his posture unnaturally still. Shadow sensed the shift in the air, pressing closer to his owner's leg, offering silent strength. The diner had fallen into a hush so complete you could hear the old wall clock ticking away seconds of unbearable tension. "This isn't a disruption," Jake replied, his voice controlled despite the storm building behind his eyes. "This is discrimination. The Americans with Disabilities Act is clear. Service animals are permitted in all public establishments." He tapped the certification paper still lying on the table. "Shadow is trained to help me function. He's not a pet." Carl Wilson smirked, leaning back in his booth with the satisfied expression of a man who believed money could buy anything, including the right to be wrong. "See? Told you it was just an excuse." Todd's face flushed deeper, spreading down his neck like a rash. "I don't need a lecture on laws. This is my diner and I make the rules here." "Actually, you don't." Maya stepped forward, coffee pot still clutched in her hand like a weapon. Federal law supersedes your rules. Jake and Shadow have every right to be here. A murmur of agreement rippled through the diner. Mrs. Henderson nodded firmly from her booth. Bill Mason stood up from his counter stool, his weathered hands braced against the Formica top. But Todd had gone too far to back down now. His pride was at stake, and like many small men with fleeting power, he chose the wrong hill to die on. "Last warning," he said, pulling out his cell phone. "Leave now, or I'm calling the police." Jake's eyes that had witnessed cities burning and brothers falling, remained fixed on Todd's face. There was no anger there, only a profound weariness that spoke of battles fought across continents. And now, inexplicably in a small town, a diner over breakfast. "Go ahead," Jake said quietly. "Call them. I've done nothing wrong." Outside, lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the diner in harsh white light for a brief moment. In that flash, everyone could see Jake's hand trembling violently against the table, even as his face remained composed. Shadow immediately pressed his weight more firmly against Jake's leg, performing his duty with silent perfection. Todd punched numbers into his phone with vicious jabs. "Yes, I need police at Rosie's diner. I have a customer refusing to leave when asked." He cast a triumphant glance around the room. "Yes, right away. Thank you." The Wilsons exchanged pleased looks as Diane primly adjusted her napkin. "Finally, someone with sense," she announced to no one in particular. Jake remained motionless except for his fingers, which had found Shadow's fur beneath the table. The simple contact, this tether to the present, kept the roaring memories. At bay, Afghanistan, the IED, the sounds no human should ever have to hear. "Todd." Maya's voice was low but carried across the diner. "This isn't right. This isn't who we are in this town." "This is exactly who we are," Bill Mason countered, his voice gravelly with emotion. "We're just usually better at hiding it." Rain lashed against the windows now, mirroring the tension inside. Jake stared down at his half-eaten breakfast, appetite long gone. Through the years of therapy, the countless nights of terror, the endless battles with a mind that refused to leave the war behind, he had fought to reclaim his dignity. And now, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, it was being stripped away again over eggs and coffee. The distant wail of sirens grew louder as blue lights reflected off the rain-slicked streets, painting the diner walls with flashes of emergency. Shadow pressed closer, sensing the storm building not just outside, but within his master. "Enough!" Maya's voice cracked through the diner like summer lightning. The coffee pot slammed onto the counter with such force that several customers jumped. Her eyes, usually warm and gentle, now blazed with righteous fury. "This stops right now, Todd." Todd's head snapped toward her, surprise flickering across his face before hardening into indignation. "Excuse me?" Maya stepped forward, placing herself between Jake and Todd. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady as steel. "What you're doing isn't just wrong. It's illegal. Service dogs are protected under federal law, period." The diner had fallen completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had emerged, dish rag in hand, spatula frozen mid-flip. The Wilsons watched with undisguised interest, as if they'd paid for dinner and a show. The ADA specifically states that a service animal must be allowed anywhere the public is normally allowed to go. Maya's words tumbled out with the force of long-held conviction. "You cannot ask Jake to leave because of Shadow. You cannot ask for special identification beyond what he's already shown you. This isn't a matter of opinion, Todd. It's the law." Todd's face darkened to a dangerous shade of crimson. "You work for me, Maya," he hissed, stepping closer to her. "And right now, you're dangerously close to looking for another job. Are you threatening to fire me for stating facts?" Maya didn't back down, though her voice wavered slightly. I'm reminding you of your place, Todd replied coldly. This is my business, and I decide who stays. Shadow's ears had flattened against his head, his dark eyes tracking every movement as the tension built. Outside, the police lights cast rhythmic, blue flashes through the rain-streaked windows, a silent countdown to confrontation. Your place. The words came soft but clear from Jake, who slowly rose to his feet. Shadow moved with him, a synchronized shadow maintaining perfect position. At his side, Jake stood tall, not the hunched figure who had entered earlier, but a man who had once commanded respect, who had led others through the worst humanity had to offer. Her place, Jake continued, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the diner, is doing exactly what she's doing, standing up for what's right, for people who can't always stand up for themselves. His left hand still trembled, but his right was steady on Shadow's head. I didn't fight for this country so people like you could pick and choose which laws to follow, Todd. Todd's face contorted. Don't lecture me about patriotism. I'm not. Jake cut him off, his voice still measured but firm. I'm talking about decency, about recognizing that some wounds aren't visible, that Shadow isn't a pet. He's medical equipment that keeps me alive, that keeps me here, present, functioning. Mrs. Henderson had risen from her booth, her crossword abandoned. Bill Mason stood at attention almost unconsciously, as if in the presence of a commanding officer. Even the tourists had gone still, bearing witness. You can fire, Maya, Jake said. You can call the police. You can make yourself feel powerful for a few minutes. But when those officers walk through that door, they'll tell you exactly what Maya just did, that you're wrong. And everyone here will remember that you chose cruelty when kindness would have cost you nothing. The diner door swung open, bringing with it the sound of rain and two police officers, water dripping from their uniform hats. They paused, taking in the scene the standing patrons, the unmistakable tension, the service dog in perfect position beside the veteran. Is there a problem here? The older officer asked, his hand resting casually on his belt as his eyes moved from Todd to Jake to Shadow. Todd opened his mouth to speak, but Maya stepped forward first. Yes, officer, she said clearly. There is definitely a problem here. Behind her, Jake stood tall, Shadow at his side, a quiet island of dignity in a storm of prejudice and ignorance. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the world clean as inside, the truth prepared to have its day. The police officers stood silently in the doorway, rain dripping from their uniform hats onto the worn linoleum floor. The older one, Officer Mercer, according to his nameplate, surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had seen countless human dramas unfold in small spaces. Someone called about a disturbance? He asked, his voice measured and neutral. Todd straightened his tie, a flash of smugness crossing his face as he stepped forward. Yes, officer, I did. This man, he gestured toward Jake, refused to leave when asked. He's brought a dog into my establishment, and when I informed him that animals aren't allowed, he became confrontational. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the diner. Bill Mason's knuckles whitened around his coffee mug. Mrs. Henderson's mouth pressed into a thin, disapproving line. That's not what happened, Maya began, but Jake gently raised his hand, silencing her protest. The younger officer had already noticed Shadow's service vest, his trained eyes taking in the situation with growing awareness. Sir, is this a service animal? He asked Jake directly. Jake nodded once, his face a mask of quiet dignity. Yes, for PTSD, fully trained and certified. I don't care what he claims, Todd interjected, his voice rising. This is my business, and I have the right to refuse service to anyone. Officer Mercer's weathered face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, of the type of small injustice he'd seen play out countless times before. Actually, sir, under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Service animals are— I know what the law says, Todd snapped, color rising in his cheeks. But there's no way to prove it's really a service dog. Anyone can buy those vests online these days. The diner had fallen silent, watching the drama unfold like a Greek tragedy where everyone knew the ending except the tragic hero himself. The rain outside intensified, beating against the windows in sheets. Jake's eyes met shadows, a silent communication passing between them. Then, with deliberate movements, he reached for his wallet, placed a $20 bill on the table, far more than his meal had cost, and took a deep breath. "It's not worth it," he said quietly, addressing no one in particular. "Come on, Shadow." The dog rose immediately, pressing close to Jake's side as they moved toward the door. The officers stepped aside, creating a path. Jake paused briefly beside them. "I served with men like you," he said softly to Officer Mercer, whose eyes widened slightly at the recognition of one veteran to another. "Good men. Shadow helps me honor their memory by keeping me here, present, allowing me to live." Officer Mercer nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement that spoke volumes in its silence. As Jake moved past the officers, the younger one murmured, "Sir, you don't have to leave. The law is on your side here." Jake's smile was barely perceptible, tinged with a weariness that went bone deep. "Some battles aren't worth fighting, son. Not today." The diner watched in collective silence as Jake walked out, Shadow matching his stride perfectly. The door swung shut behind them with a final sounding chime, leaving only the sound of rain and the uncomfortable weight of shame hanging in the air. Maya stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes as she watched through the rain-streaked window. As Jake and Shadow made their way across the parking lot, the veteran's shoulders now slightly hunched against the downpour. No umbrella, no shelter, just a man and his dog walking away from yet another battlefield. "Are you satisfied now?" she asked Todd, her voice breaking. "Are you proud of what you've done?" Todd's expression wavered between defiance and the first flickerings of doubt. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away footprints as Jake and Shadow disappeared from view, two silhouettes gradually fading into the gray curtain of the storm. Officer Mercer cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Well, I guess our work here is done," he said, though his eyes lingered on Todd with unmistakable judgment. "No law against being wrong, I suppose." The bell above the door jingled one last time as the officers departed, leaving behind a diner full of witnesses to a small, everyday injustice, the kind that changes nothing and everything all at once. The lunchtime crowd at Rosie's diner had thinned to just a handful of regulars, the morning's drama leaving behind a palpable tension that hung in the air like smoke. Maya moved mechanically between tables, her usual warm smile replaced by tight-lipped silence. Todd had retreated to his office, the door firmly shut against the weight of unspoken judgment that filled the dining room. What no one had noticed was 16-year-old Ellie Parker tucked into the corner booth near the restrooms, her phone carefully positioned between the napkin holder and the sugar caddy. While adults had watched in stunned silence, Ellie had pressed record, capturing every word, every gesture, every moment of the confrontation in startling clarity. Now, back in her bedroom, homework abandoned on her desk, Ellie's fingers flew across her keyboard. The video needed minimal editing. The raw footage told a story more powerful than any caption could enhance. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed the title, "Veteran with Service Dog Kicked Out of Diner." A moment's hesitation, then she added, "A hero treated like a criminal." "This happened this morning at Rosie's diner," she wrote in the description. "A veteran with PTSD and his service dog were humiliated and forced to leave. This isn't right. This isn't who we should be." One deep breath. Then another. Click. Upload. Across town, Jake sat on the edge of his bed, still in his rain-soaked clothes. Shadow lay beside him, head resting on his thigh, dark eyes never leaving his face. The familiar weight anchored him as memories threatened to pull him under. Not of war this time, but of the morning's humiliation, of walking away rather than fighting, of retreat. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from Maya. "I'm so sorry about what happened. It wasn't right." He couldn't find the words to respond. What was there to say? That this was just one more battle in an endless war? That he was tired of fighting for the simple right to exist in public spaces? Across town, Ellie's phone began to vibrate with notifications. 10 shares, 50 shares, 100 comments, the numbers climbing with dizzying speed. Is this in Millfield? Boycott this place. Who's the manager? Name and shame. That poor veteran. This is how we treat our heroes? By mid-afternoon, local news stations had picked up the story. By evening, it had jumped to regional coverage. Jake's face, captured in profile, shoulders squared despite the visible tremor in his hands, became the symbol of a larger conversation. Shadow, perfect in his service vest, the picture of canine dignity and purpose, filled comment sections with outrage and heartbreak. Mayor Wilson was giving a statement by 7 o'clock, standing awkwardly before cameras on the steps of City Hall. "This incident does not reflect the values of our community," he insisted, sweat beading on his upper lip despite the cool evening air. "We honor our veterans. We respect the law." At home, Maya sat cross-legged on her couch, watching the video for the 5th time. Each viewing brought fresh tears and growing rage. She recognized Ellie's username and sent a simple message. "Thank you for recording this, for making it real, for not letting it disappear." Ellie replied instantly, "I couldn't just watch and do nothing." By nightfall, the video had reached 500,000 views and was still climbing. National veteran groups had begun sharing it, adding their own messages of support and outrage. Social media buzzed with calls for accountability, for apologies, for change. In his small apartment across town, Jake remained unaware of his newfound fame. He sat in his darkened living room, Shadow's head heavy on his lap, the television dark, his phone silent beside him. Outside his window, the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind puddles that reflected streetlights like scattered stars. The storm had passed, but another was gathering, one of public opinion and righteous anger, of viral outrage and calls for justice. By morning, Jake's quiet dignity would be transformed into something else entirely, a battle cry for respect, for understanding, for the simple right to exist in public with the companion who made that existence possible. "Have you seen this?" The message pinged on thousands of phones across the country, spreading like wildfire through veteran support groups, military forums, and social media platforms. The video, raw, unfiltered reality captured in just under 4 minutes, became a digital inferno that no one could contain. By midnight, the view count had surpassed 1 million. By dawn, it had tripled. In a small apartment in San Diego, former Marine Corps Sergeant Alicia Martinez watched the footage. For the 3rd time, her coffee growing cold beside her laptop. Her hands shook with barely contained fury as she typed, "This is how they treat our brothers when they come home. This is what we fought for." Her post was shared 5,000 times before she even closed her laptop. In Chicago, retired Colonel James Watkins forwarded the link to every member of his VFW post with a single line, "All hands on deck, one of our own needs us." Within minutes, his phone began ringing. Veterans from 3 states asking what the plan was, how they would respond, what could be done. The hashtag #StandWithJake trended nationally by 9 a.m. Military families changed their profile pictures. To service dogs in solidarity, veterans posted images of themselves with their own service animals, stories pouring out like long-sealed wounds finally lanced, tales of discrimination, of being turned away, of fighting battles at home they never expected to face after surviving war zones. I couldn't enter my own cousin's wedding because of my service dog. Was told I couldn't bring my pet into a restaurant last month. This happens every day. 22 veterans commit suicide daily. Service dogs save lives. This isn't about pets. This is about survival. In her small apartment across town, Maya Coleman hadn't slept. Her eyes burned from crying, from rage, from scrolling through endless comments of support and outrage. At 5:23 a.m., she made a decision. With trembling fingers, she created a post of her own. My name is Maya Coleman. I was the waitress in the video that's going viral. What you saw was only part of the story. She typed furiously, detailing Jake's quiet dignity over the 2 years she'd served him. How Shadow would gently press against Jake's leg when his hands began to shake. How Jake never asked for special treatment, only the basic respect the law guaranteed him. How Todd had ignored repeated explanations about the ADA requirements. Jake never raised his voice, never made demands. He simply stood by the law that was designed to protect people like him, people who have already sacrificed more than most of us can imagine. And we failed him. I failed him by not doing more. She ended with a plea. If you're angry, don't just post about it. Do something. Learn about service animals. Speak up when you see discrimination. And yes, let Todd know how you feel, but remember that hatred only creates more hatred. What Jake needs isn't vengeance, it's understanding. Her post was shared by Ellie within minutes, then appended to the original video. Comments flooded in, Maya's inbox filling faster than she could read them. Outside Jake's apartment, reporters had begun to gather. 3 news vans parked along the curb, cameras ready. Producers making calls to track down the hero veteran whose humiliation had touched a nerve in the American psyche. Inside, Jake finally turned on his phone to find 347 missed calls. Over 1,000 text messages, and an inbox so full it had stopped accepting new emails. Shadow sensed his rising anxiety and pressed close, offering the steadying presence that had become Jake's lifeline. One text caught his eye, from a number he didn't recognize. Sir, this is Sergeant Major Williams, USMC retired. You're not alone, we've got your 6. Permission to proceed. The digital storm gathered strength, transforming from mere outrage into something more focused, more powerful, a movement seeking not just justice for one man and his dog, but recognition of a deeper failure, a society that honored its warriors in words while failing them in deeds, a nation that had forgotten the meaning of the very freedoms those warriors had fought to protect. Gunnery Sergeant Michael Ramirez hadn't slept in 24 hours. The video had reached him during night training exercises at Camp Pendleton, passed from phone to phone until it reached the command tent. The moment he saw Jake's face, older, wearier, but unmistakably the same man who had pulled him from a burning Humvee outside Fallujah, sleep became impossible. That's our LT, he'd whispered. The desert training ground suddenly forgotten as memories flooded back. Lieutenant Jacob Harmon, the man who had led their unit through the worst days of their deployment, the officer who carried a picture of every Marine under his command and could recite their hometowns, their girlfriends' names, their dreams for when they got home. Now, huddled around a small table in the barracks, Ramirez faced 3 other Marines from that same unit: Corporal Davis, Staff Sergeant Wilson, and Lance Corporal Martinez. All had seen the video. All recognized the haunted look in their former lieutenant's eyes. All understood the significance of Shadow's presence at his side. "We should have kept in touch," Martinez said, his voice thick with regret. "After he was medevaced out, we just lost track." Davis nodded grimly. "You know the LT. Never wanted to burden anyone. Probably thought he was doing us a favor by disappearing." The silence that followed was heavy with shared guilt, the unspoken acknowledgement that they had allowed one of their own to face civilian battles alone. In war, they had lived by an unbreakable code, no Marine left behind. Yet in peace, that bond had frayed, stretched thin by distance and time and their own struggles to adjust. "He's only 3 hours from here," Ramirez finally said, pulling up. A map on his phone. I checked. Wilson leaned forward, his face set with determination. "So what's the plan, Gunny? We rolling out or what?" "Damn right we are." Ramirez's voice carried the same authority it had in combat. Clear, confident, brooking no argument. "I've got 48 hours of leave approved. Just need transportation." Martinez's smile was slow but genuine. "My brother's got a garage in San Diego. 3 restored Harleys and a pickup truck. Said we could borrow whatever we need." Outside the barracks window, dawn was breaking over the California coastline, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The same sun was rising over Jake's small apartment hundreds of miles away, where he sat staring at his phone in disbelief as messages continued to pour in. "We need to be smart about this," Ramirez cautioned, military precision taking over as he outlined their approach. "This isn't about making a scene or getting revenge. It's about showing the LT he's still got his unit behind him." Davis nodded. Brotherhood doesn't expire with discharge papers. Within the hour, 4 Marines in civilian clothes loaded into a pickup truck, each carrying memories of the man who had once led them through hell and brought them home again. The man who had written condolence letters in his own blood-stained hands when paper couldn't be found. The man who had given his own water ration to a wounded Iraqi child during the worst of the summer heat. As they pulled onto the highway, Wilson glanced at his phone one last time, reading aloud the newest comment. Under the viral video, "Just wait until you see what happens when you mess with a Marine and his service dog." Marines don't forget, and we sure as hell don't forgive. Martinez shook his head. "Whoever wrote that doesn't understand. This isn't about vengeance." "No," Ramirez agreed, eyes fixed on the road ahead as the miles began to fall away. "It's about reminding the LT who he is, who we all are together." The truck gathered speed, 4 warriors answering a call that transcended duty, the sacred obligation to stand beside a brother who had once carried them all. Behind them, the rising sun cast their shadows long across the highway, 4 silhouettes merging into one unified force, driving toward a small town where a quiet veteran and his service dog had inadvertently ignited a movement. In war, they had been unstoppable together. In peace, they would prove no less formidable. "This isn't just about one man anymore." Sergeant Major Wilson's voice filled the dimly lit VFW hall, where 30 veterans of varying ages sat in perfect attention. Outside, rain had begun again, drumming against the metal roof like distant artillery. "This is about every service member who comes home, carrying wounds no one can see." The impromptu meeting had started with just a handful of local veterans who had seen the video. Within hours, it had grown to include representatives from 3 counties, 5 branches of service, and conflicts spanning from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Men and women who had once worn different uniforms, now united by a common purpose and a shared outrage. "Operation Honor," Wilson continued, writing the words on the whiteboard with military precision. "Objective, recognition, not retribution." Across town, in a small apartment filled with houseplants and medical textbooks, Maya Coleman's phone buzzed with a notification, an invitation to a private group. Justice for Jake and Shadow, Coordination Center. The membership count already exceeded 2,000. She clicked Join without hesitation. The group description was simple. "This is not about attacking a business or individual. This is about education, about recognition, about ensuring what happened to Jake and Shadow never happens to another veteran and service animal. If you're here for revenge, you're in the wrong place." Posts appeared in rapid succession. Veterans sharing resources, legal experts outlining ADA protections, service dog trainers offering free educational seminars for local businesses. The digital battlefield was being mapped with tactical precision. At Camp Pendleton, Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez's truck had become command central for a growing convoy. What had started as 4 Marines had expanded to include 2 Humvees filled with active duty personnel who had taken emergency leave, plus 3 civilian vehicles carrying veterans who had heard the call and responded without question. Remember, Ramirez addressed them as they prepared to depart. "We represent the Corps. This is not an invasion. This is not a punishment detail. This is about standing with our brother, about reminding an entire town what it means when we say, 'No one left behind.'" In Indianapolis, the National Service Dog Association issued an emergency press release, offering free training to any business in Jake's town. "Discrimination often stems from ignorance, not malice," their statement read. "Education is the most powerful weapon against prejudice." Back in the VFW hall, planning continued with military precision. Maps were spread across tables, timelines established, communications protocols developed. Veterans who hadn't touched their uniforms in decades now stood straight-backed and focused, rejuvenated by purpose. "We need Jake's permission before we proceed," Wilson reminded them. "This is his battle. We're just reinforcements." A silver-haired Vietnam veteran in the back raised his hand. "What if he says no? Some of us, we're not comfortable asking for help, especially the ones who need it most." Wilson nodded, understanding etched into the lines of his weathered face. "Then we proceed with Phase 2, community education. Either way, something changes in this town. Either way, the next veteran with a service dog walks into that diner without fear." Meanwhile, in the growing online community, Maya's post had become a rallying point. Jake never wanted attention. He just wanted breakfast, like anyone else. "Let's make sure the next veteran with a service dog gets exactly that. Normalcy, respect, dignity." Thousands of comments flooded in beneath it. "Standing by for orders. Ready to deploy. Former Army medic here. How can I help?" As night fell across America, an invisible network took shape. Veterans and civilians, active duty and retired, all connected by a shared conviction that what had happened to Jake and Shadow wasn't just a regrettable incident, but a symptom of a deeper failure, a failure they now intended to correct. In his apartment, unaware of the forces mobilizing on his behalf, Jake finally fell into fitful sleep. Shadow curled protectively at his side. His phone continued to light up with messages from brothers and sisters in arms he hadn't spoken to in years, each one the same essential promise: "We're coming. You're not alone anymore." The afternoon, lull had settled over Rosie's diner, a handful of customers nursing coffee cups and picking at pie slices. Todd had emerged from his office, tension still visible in the tight line of his shoulders as he restlessly reorganized menus. Behind the counter, the morning's drama had faded to uncomfortable whispers, yet the air remained charged, as if the building itself remembered the injustice that had unfolded within its walls. Maya wiped down tables with mechanical precision, her thoughts miles away with Jake and Shadow. The gentle chime of the bell above the door barely registered as another customer entered, then another and another. It was Mrs. Henderson who noticed first, her crossword puzzle forgotten as she glanced out the window. "Oh, my lord," she whispered, loud enough that heads turned toward her, then followed her gaze outside. The convoy had arrived without sirens or fanfare, a precision formation of vehicles flowing into the parking lot with military discipline. First came the motorcycles, 6 of them, riders in dress blues, then 3 black SUVs. Behind them, 2 restored military transport trucks. Finally, a line of civilian vehicles that stretched down the block. What in the world? Todd moved too. The window, coffee pot frozen in mid-air. Outside, car doors opened with synchronized purpose. Boots hit pavement in perfect rhythm. Marines in full-dress uniform emerged. First one, then five, then dozens. They formed lines without a word being spoken, an unbroken sea of blue and gold standing at parade rest, faces forward, expressions unreadable beneath the sharp brims of their covers. At their center stood Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez, his ribbons and medals catching the afternoon sunlight. Beside him, a gap in formation, a space precisely the size of one man and one service dog. Main Street had gone silent. Store owners stepped onto sidewalks. Passing cars slowed, then stopped entirely. Cell phones appeared in dozens of hands, capturing the moment in real time as it spread across social media platforms faster than any planned broadcast could have achieved. Inside the diner, Todd's face had drained of color. "What are they doing?" he asked, though no one answered. No, one needed to. The message was clear in the disciplined lines, the pristine uniforms, the empty space in their formation, a visual representation of the void left when a warrior is cast out. Not a single Marine stepped toward the diner. Not one made a threatening move or uttered a word of condemnation. They simply stood, a living monument to brotherhood, to the code that bound them together long after the wars had ended. From the kitchen, Cook emerged, wiping his hands on his apron. "Jesus," he breathed, taking in the sight. "There must be 50 of them out there." 67, corrected Bill Mason, who had arrived moments earlier and now stood by the door, his VFW cap held respectfully over his heart. From 5 different units, 3 war zones, 1 brotherhood, a black SUV with government plates pulled up, and a distinguished older man in civilian clothes stepped out. The ribbons on his chest told the story his tailored suit tried to hide. A high-ranking officer, now retired. He surveyed the formation with approval before turning toward the diner, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd until it locked on Todd through the window. Maya moved to the door, pushing it open. The silence outside was deafening. No orders being shouted, no demands being made, just the disciplined presence of men and women who had faced death together and now stood in silent tribute to one of their own. Someone in the crowd began to weep softly. A child pointed in wonder. A teenager whispered to her friend, "I've never seen anything like this." "Neither has this town," Bill Mason replied, though the words weren't meant for her. "But by God, they'll never forget it." The Marines continued, their silent vigil as the afternoon sun cast their shadows long across the parking lot, 67 sentinels standing for the one who had walked away in the rain just hours before. The door to Jake's apartment opened slowly, revealing Sergeant Major Williams standing at perfect attention in his dress blues. Behind him stood Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez and Staff Sergeant Wilson, their faces solemn beneath the sharp brims of their covers. "Lieutenant Harmon," Williams said formally, "your Marines request your presence, sir." Jake stood frozen in the doorway, shadow alert at his side. The tremor in his left hand intensified as recognition dawned. Faces from another lifetime, brothers. From battlefields half a world away, men he had led through hell, men he had tried to forget, as he tried to forget so much of who he once was. "I'm not a lieutenant anymore," Jake said quietly. "Haven't been for a long time." Williams's expression never changed. "With respect, sir, that's not how it works. You know that better than most." Shadow pressed against Jake's leg, sensing the storm of emotions. Confusion, pride, fear, longing that washed through his master. Jake's hand found the dog's head, drawing strength from the familiar contact. "What is this about?" he asked, though the viral video on his phone had already given him the answer. "About setting things right," Ramirez replied simply. "About reminding this town, and maybe you, sir, of something important." 30 minutes later, a black SUV with government plates pulled up half a block from Rosie's diner, the Marines standing, vigil straightened imperceptibly as Jake stepped out, shadow moving in perfect synchronization beside him. He wore no uniform, just the same faded navy jacket from that morning, but his posture had changed. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, his eyes, still haunted, but now alight with something that might have been pride, scanned the formation. Before him, "You didn't have to do this," he said to Williams, who now walked beside him. "Yes, sir, we did." The crowd parted as Jake approached the diner, Shadow maintaining his perfect heel position. Phones recorded from every angle. Whispers rippled through the gathered spectators. But Jake saw none of it. His focus had narrowed to the path before him, to the next step, then the next. The way he had taught himself to survive after coming home, one moment at a time, one foot in front of the other. The Marines snapped to attention as he passed between their ranks, a corridor of honor leading to the diner's door. No commands were given, none were needed. This was the unspoken language of warriors. Discipline, honed in combat, respect earned in blood. Maya stood at the entrance, tears streaming unchecked down her face. Beyond her, Todd remained frozen behind the counter, his earlier bravado evaporated like morning dew. Jake paused at the threshold, his hand finding Shadow's head one more time, the signal they had practiced countless times in therapy. "I'm okay. We're safe. We belong here." Then, with deliberate steps, man and dog entered the diner. The silence was absolute as Jake moved to the same corner booth he had occupied that morning. Shadow settled beneath the table in the same protective curl. Jake's hands, one steady, one trembling, rested on the tabletop in plain view. Williams took the seat opposite him, while Ramirez and Wilson positioned themselves at the counter, their presence both watchful and calm. Outside, the formation remained, standing vigil beneath the afternoon sun. "Coffee, black," Jake said to Maya, who had approached with the pot already in hand. His voice was quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the hushed diner. "And water." "For Shadow, please." "Coming right up," she replied, her smile tremulous but genuine. No speeches were made, no demands issued, none were necessary. The simple act, a veteran and his service dog claiming the space that law and decency had already granted them, spoke volumes that no words could capture. In the corner, Mrs. Henderson began to applaud softly. Bill Mason joined. Then the truckers, then everyone. A gentle wave of recognition washing through the diner. Outside, the Marines remained motionless, their silence more powerful than any shout could have been. Shadow pressed against Jake's leg, a steady presence anchoring him in the moment. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the weight on Jake's shoulders felt just a little lighter. The weight of 67 silent Marines seemed to press down on Todd Reynolds as he stood behind the counter, sweat beading along his hairline despite the diner's air conditioning. His eyes darted between Jake, sitting with perfect composure, in the corner booth, and the uniformed men and women who had transformed his parking lot into what looked like a military parade ground. "Look," Todd finally said, his voice cracking as he approached Jake's table, hands raised in what he hoped was a placating gesture. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I never meant to, Mr. Reynolds." The interruption came from Colonel James Barrett, who had entered behind Jake and now stood with the straight-backed posture of a man who had commanded troops in 3 different war zones. His voice was not raised, yet it filled the diner with unmistakable authority. "I don't believe anyone is interested in what you meant to do. The facts of what you did are quite clear." Todd swallowed hard. "This is getting out of hand. I run a business. I have to consider all my customers. Then perhaps you should consider the law as well." Colonel Barrett removed a folded document from his breast pocket, placing it carefully on the table. "The Americans with Disabilities Act, Title III, specifically protects the rights of service animal handlers in places of public accommodation. Lieutenant Harmon and Shadow are legally entitled to be here. Your actions this morning were not just unkind, they were illegal. The diner had gone completely silent, every ear straining to catch each word. Outside, the Marines remained at parade rest, their disciplined presence visible through every window. Lieutenant Harmon served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Barrett continued, his tone conversational, yet carrying to every corner of the room. During his final deployment, his unit came under heavy fire while evacuating civilians from a village. Despite sustaining injuries himself, he continued coordinating the evacuation, ensuring every civilian and every Marine under his command made it to safety. Jake's eyes remained fixed on the table before him, his expression unreadable. Shadow pressed closer to his leg beneath the table, sensing the tension in his master. The bronze star with Combat V and Purple Heart he earned that day are only part of his service record. What isn't recorded in those citations is how many nights he went without sleep to write letters home for his Marines, how he shared his rations with local children, how he carried a wounded Afghan interpreter 3 miles to an extraction point. Mrs. Henderson's napkin was pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Bill Mason stood at rigid attention near the counter, his VFW cap held over his heart. Shadow isn't a pet, Mr. Reynolds. He's a highly trained medical device that allows Lieutenant Harmon to function in civilian life despite the PTSD that came home with him from war. To deny Shadow entry is no different than denying entry to someone with a wheelchair or oxygen tank. From a nearby booth, a middle-aged woman stood suddenly, gathering her purse and half-eaten meal. "I can't sit here anymore," she announced, her voice quavering with emotion. "Not in a place that would treat a veteran this way." She wasn't alone. 2 construction workers left their coffee cups and threw bills on the table. A family of 4 quietly stood and headed for the door. One by one, customers began to leave, each exit like a silent indictment. "I didn't know," Todd said weakly. His earlier confidence evaporated. "I didn't understand. That's the problem, isn't it?" Maya spoke up from behind the counter, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Too many people don't know, don't understand. But ignorance isn't an excuse when the law is clear." Outside, more people had gathered, town residents, drawn by social media reports of the gathering, standing respectfully behind the line of Marines. Inside, Jake's coffee cup remained untouched, steam rising like a silent prayer in the heavy air. "You have a choice now, Mr. Reynolds," Colonel Barrett said quietly. "You can continue as you were, or you can take this opportunity to learn, to grow, to be part of the solution rather than the problem." The weight of choice, of consequence, settled over Todd like a physical burden as he stood surrounded by the living testament to brotherhood, to sacrifice, to the cost of the freedoms he had taken for granted his entire life. 3 weeks had passed since the morning that changed everything. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the newly renovated meeting hall of VFW Post 423 as Jake stood before a crowded room, Shadow a steady presence at his side. His left hand still trembled as he adjusted the microphone, but his voice rang clear and strong. "Service dogs aren't just companions," he explained, gesturing to Shadow, who sat perfectly positioned beside him. "They're highly trained medical equipment that allows veterans like me to navigate a world that sometimes feels impossible." The audience, a mix of local business owners, community leaders, and fellow veterans, listened with rapt attention. Bill Mason sat in the front row, nodding encouragement, while Colonel Barrett stood at the back, arms crossed, a small smile of approval on his weathered face. This was Jake's 3rd presentation this month. What had begun as a single educational session had evolved into something more profound, a mission to ensure what happened at Rosie's Diner never happened to another veteran in their community. "Next week," Jake continued, his confidence growing with each word, "Shadow and I will Begin working with Guardians of Valor, training new service dogs for veterans on the waiting list. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. When I came home from Afghanistan, I thought my days of service were over. I was wrong. They had just changed form. Across town, Maya Coleman hung her apron on a new hook in a very different kind of establishment. The Veterans Haven Cafe had opened just days earlier, its walls adorned with military memorabilia and photographs spanning conflicts from World War II to Afghanistan. Its mission statement, posted prominently by the entrance, was simple: a place of welcome for those who served and education for those who didn't. "First day jitters?" asked the owner, herself a retired Army nurse. "You're doing great." Maya smiled, watching as the afternoon crowd of veterans and civilians mingled over coffee and conversation. "It feels right," she replied. "Like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Her phone buzzed with a text from Ellie. "Did you see the police sign go up at Rosie's?" She had. Everyone had. The diner's business had evaporated after that fateful morning, not from any organized boycott, but from the quiet decisions of hundreds of individuals who chose to spend their money elsewhere. Todd had tried to make amends with a hastily written apology posted on the door, but it was too little, too late. Some lessons came at a higher cost than others. Back at the VFW hall, Jake concluded his presentation to enthusiastic applause. As people gathered around him with questions and handshakes, Colonel Barrett approached from the back of the room. "The non-profit board was impressed with your proposal," he said, handing Jake a formal envelope. "Full funding for the first year, 5 service dogs to start, with more as the program grows." Jake stared at the envelope, momentarily speechless. Shadow pressed against his leg, grounding him in the present as emotions threatened to overwhelm him. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed. "You've said enough," Barrett replied, his hand resting briefly on Jake's shoulder. "Now it's time to do the work. These dogs will change lives, just like Shadow changed yours." Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, dusting the VFW parking lot with delicate white flakes. Jake watched through the window as his former Marines climbed into their vehicles, preparing to return to bases and assignments scattered across the country. They had stayed longer than necessary, helping establish the foundation of his new program, ensuring he was firmly reconnected to the brotherhood he had once tried to leave behind. That evening, as Jake walked Shadow through the quiet streets of the town that had once seemed so indifferent to his existence, his phone rang. Maya's voice came through, excited and a little breathless. "You won't believe who just came into the cafe," she said. "The Wilsons, that couple from that morning. They asked about Shadow. They wanted to learn." Jake stopped walking, surprised. Into silence. "People can change," Maya continued. "Not all of them. Not always, but sometimes." As if to punctuate her words, a passing car slowed beside Jake. The window rolled down to reveal Mrs. Henderson, her kind face framed by a woolen scarf. "Evening, Lieutenant," she called out. "You and Shadow stay warm now." Jake raised his hand in acknowledgement, watching as she drove away. Shadow looked up at him expectantly, alert to the shift in his master's emotions. "Come on, boy," Jake said, softly, turning toward home. "We've got work to do tomorrow." The snow continued to fall, covering the town in a clean white blanket, not erasing what had happened, but offering the promise of new beginnings. For Jake and Shadow, for Maya, for a community forever changed by the quiet courage of a man and his dog who had simply wanted to have breakfast in peace. The battle they had never expected to fight had led to a victory they had never thought to seek. Not just recognition, but purpose. Not just acceptance, but belonging. Sometimes the smallest moments create the largest ripples. A quiet veteran with trembling hands, a service dog maintaining perfect vigilance, a diner on an ordinary morning that became the unlikely battleground for dignity and respect. Jake's story could have ended differently. It could have faded into the background noise of everyday injustices. One more veteran returning to an empty apartment, doors closing that should have remained open, rights denied that should have been guaranteed. One more invisible wound deepened by the very society he had sacrificed to protect. But destiny had other plans. A teenager's trembling finger on a record button. A waitress who refused to remain silent. Marines who remembered their sacred oath. No one left behind. Not in combat. Not in peace. Not ever. The true power of Jake and Shadow's story wasn't in the confrontation, but in the response, the unwavering certainty with which an entire community of warriors mobilized for one of their own, not with violence or threats, but with dignity, with presence, with the silent, unbreakable power of standing together. In the months that followed, something extraordinary blossomed from those painful seeds. Service dog education programs spread to schools across the county. Business owners displayed service animals welcome signs in their windows, not from fear of boycotts, but from genuine understanding. The Veterans Haven Cafe became a gathering, place where civilians and veterans built bridges across experiences that had once seemed impossibly distant. Jake and Shadow continued their work, training new service dogs for veterans still fighting private battles. Each graduation ceremony, a veteran matched with their new companion, became a celebration attended by Marines in dress blues, by community members who had witnessed the power of these extraordinary animals, by those who understood that some wounds require unique medicine. The diner where it all began eventually reopened under new ownership, a retired Marine Corps chef who named the first item on the menu Shadow's Special and donated a portion of each sale to service animal training. Programs. One morning's cruelty had sparked a movement of compassion. One veteran's dignity had reminded an entire community of values too easily forgotten in civilian life. One service dog's unwavering loyalty had taught a profound lesson about what it means to truly stand beside those who served. In the end, loyalty isn't just for war, it's for life. Comment loyal if you believe service animals deserve respect. Subscribe for more real-life stories that remind us of what truly matters.